Johnny Walsh joins us now from DC. He is with the United States Institute of Peace. He's a senior expert there. And probably more importantly, he is a former US diplomat and he served in Iraq and Afghanistan. Hi, Johnny. Thanks for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
2001, after 9/11, I was one of the first reporters to cross the river from Tajikistan into northern Afghanistan, where the Taliban had basically taken over 95% of the country and were fighting with the Northern Alliance. It wasn't much of a fight at that point, but they were asked to give up Al-Qaeda and to stop Al-Qaeda from using Afghanistan as a training base to attack America. They refused, and thus, U.S. troops started to pour in from the air and elsewhere. And here we are all these years later, and U.S. troops are still on the ground. Surprised?
Surprised that Afghanistan fell so far from the promise that it held in 2001 and 2. I mean, that was a moment of tremendous hope. Afghanistan was not really a case like Iraq, where the country started falling apart almost as soon as the U.S. came in. There was a great period there. On the other hand, the Taliban are the reason Afghanistan is in such rough shape right now, and they've been pretty consistent all this time. They are very disciplined, very unified, very, very lethal on the battlefield, very brutal in a lot of contexts, but maybe pragmatic enough to look for a political way out of this conflict that would accomplish enough of their objectives.
Why do I think, and tell me I'm thinking cynically, but why do I think that their way out is probably just to get power again, and that's what they're after?
Well, I think that for many of them, probably for most of their top leaders, that would be the preferred outcome. And they do see themselves as very militarily strong. Some of them straight up think they could just wait till the US leaves and eventually retake the country. The thing that works against that is that more and more of them appear to see that that is a years-long proposition of grinding conflict, civil war with a huge body count, not least on their own side, that might in fact never truly end in their favor. And so when they look at the prospect of a negotiation like that involves compromise by everybody, that's in the nature of a political settlement or a peace agreement. It's usually not everybody's first preference, like every part of the outcome. But on the other hand, like there might be a formula where they could achieve their core goals, which is the ultimate departure of the foreign troops and what they consider a more Islamic system, without totally dismantling necessarily what's in place right now. And most importantly, that would be a way to end what has become the world's most violent war for the last few years, which nobody seems to have a really credible military way out of.
And yet they just keep on, even through negotiations, carrying out attacks. I mean, they recently attacked a maternity ward. You talk about a brutal attack. That was one of them in Kabul.
I think that was an ISIS attack, but in general, the Taliban have crossed some pretty heinous lines many times. The violence is very high right now, and it's not tolerable. It's causing an enormous body count on all sides, but certainly Taliban-initiated attacks are. I think what's important to keep in mind is that violence for the Taliban, as for so many insurgencies, is where all their leverage comes from. So it's not that it wouldn't be good for them to stop right now, but it's not really realistic that that violence stops before there's any kind of political deal on the table. Just as the government's main leverage is political power and it can share it as the situation requires, the Taliban's is violence and it can reduce it as the situation requires. Those two things are going to be at the core of any peace agreement, if there is one.
Why do I think a lot of the Afghans that I know, I mean, the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and others will look at any kind of a peace deal pretty cynically and think that it's not going, there's that word again, cynically, but they'll look at it and think, over time, this is just going to unravel. And as Afghanistan traditionally is a place where people just tend to grind away at one another and the fighting begins again.
Well, it's been true for the last couple of generations. I do always stress to people that Afghanistan has not always been a place of civil war. It actually had a pretty stable 20th century before the Soviets came in. So that's living memory for these players, and I don't think it's at all impossible to get back to a different reality. In terms of Uzbeks and Tajiks, they absolutely look at the Taliban, which is like a ethnic Pashtun religious fundamentalist movement that shares nothing in common with many of the other constituencies in Afghanistan, these other groups look at the Taliban with horror. And sometimes the feeling's mutual. I would say, though, that in spite of that, and I would add that the Taliban never, let's say, poll better than 15% approval or 18% approval or something in the country. Pretty hard to poll in Afghanistan, but that is beyond any margin of error. They are unpopular. However, all of these groups have seen now that even with that level of popularity, the Taliban can keep this fight up forever. Not necessarily win it, but recruit endless fighters and launch attacks in every corner of the country.
Because you cannot deal with them when they're across the border in Pakistan, right? And they're probably getting support from the ISI, and they regroup and relaunch again and again and again.
They do. They do. I mean, I often stress that the vast majority of Taliban fighters are in Afghanistan, from Afghanistan, and they get all their stuff inside of Afghanistan. But the sanctuary that Pakistan gives their senior leaders makes the group all the harder to actually defeat, because those people are essentially untouchable right now.
So when you talk to American commanders, for instance, who have been in there fighting and losing soldiers, this tremendous effort at the beginning to stand up a democratic government, to get the militias to put down their weapons, to educate women and open schools, and all of a sudden you say, yeah, you know, you're going to have to make a deal with the Taliban. How do you sell them on that?
Well, I think it's tough for all sides to accept the idea of peace with the people that they've been fighting with for all this time. Certainly for the US military. I mean, I come and I advocate for peace because I think it's the only happy ending that is plausible for Afghanistan. But I don't like the idea of it either. I mean, I've had friends hurt, killed by the Taliban too. That's what war is. Not to preach on that subject, but I think that the US military, by and large, has really embraced this too, because Afghanistan, the war has gone on for far too long. And so I would really stress that peace to our military commanders, peace to people like me, does not mean dismantling women's rights or democracy or the security forces that have been built up all this time. Like, there will be compromises, but on the really important stuff, it's important for negotiators to hold their ground too. Peace means finding a way that all of the different constituencies in Afghanistan can be part of the system, which generally is not true right now. And I think that while it will be a very difficult negotiation, I'm not here predicting success, you can imagine ways that what's really important can in fact be preserved. And the last thought on that is, many of us see the peace process as the way to preserve these post-2001 gains, as opposed to like a way to sacrifice them. Because the alternative is an eventual meltdown of the country if the conflict just continues forever. And that will certainly not be good for rights, democracy, and everything else that's been accomplished during the last generation.
I mean, America spent a lot of money and a lot of time trying to build up the Afghan army there in special forces. And I assume that under the peace deal, the Taliban absolutely want US troops off Afghan soil. Would that happen? And could the Afghan army, you know, they've stood up on their own, but they've been pretty wobbly.
I mean, so there is a pathway right now to a complete US withdrawal. That was part of the core of the bilateral deal that the US and Taliban made earlier this year, that it would be sort of a pathway to zero troops if the Taliban did certain things in return. That could happen. It is certainly true that the Afghan forces are doing the overwhelming majority of the fighting right now. The US support is quite helpful to them, but I wouldn't want to sell them short on that regard, especially some of the really crack units like their special forces, which are maintaining their end of this grinding conflict and have been for a long time.
They need US air
power. If all of the US support were, they benefit from US air power. They're developing their own air force too. We'll see how that evolves in the next couple of years. And it would be a much uglier conflict without the US forces around, that's to be sure. And that's why the US has a lot of leverage on this, because it doesn't have to withdraw its forces if it perceives the Taliban aren't serious.
Do you think that there's going to be a deal? I mean, we've just seen a prisoner release, I assume, of Taliban prisoners. I assume that that's encouraging. There's obviously progress in discussions.
I don't want to be overly rosy about it. I don't know how to predict what the actual odds of a successful, grand bargain signing at the end of this are. I would say this is by far the closest
Sorry, I want to interrupt you there because you're cutting out. So
to
hang
us.
on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So you wouldn't want to predict, but you would say by far.
I don't want to predict the odds of a grand bargain signing at the end. It's always been hard. It's never been that likely. But the opportunity now is by far the largest it's ever been. There have been huge breakthroughs, really on all sides, in what lines they're willing to cross to seriously explore this. Both sides have appointed very, very credible teams of negotiators to work through some of the weightiest issues in the country. So that's a lot more wind in the sails than many processes that eventually lead to peace agreements start with. So for good negotiators, it's a lot to work with. Now, on the other hand, the positions of the parties are very far apart. But this would hardly be the first time that when talks started, each side thought they were going to get a 90-10 deal and they had to start working towards something in the middle that both could live with. I don't know what that'll look like. I think it'll take a long time. But the opportunity is tremendous. And the odds of a good outcome for the US or Afghan governments by military means are much lower than the odds of a good outcome by diplomatic means.
I don't think anybody thought it was going to be a short fight. And, some of my American friends say to me, what are we still doing in Afghanistan? And I thought we won there. I thought there was victory, or there's never going to be victory there. And American commanders, General Petraeus for one, said, look, this is easily a 20-year insurgency fight, that the job there is to stop Afghanistan from being used as a launch pad for extremists carrying out attacks on Americans and terror training centers. And so the 20-year insurgency fight is saving us being attacked at home. So I think commanders have seen it a lot differently than American politicians have. And is this really now the time to stop that long, bloody campaign, but one that protects America?
Well, it all depends on what kind of stop we're talking about. I think as much as most Americans would like to see us just out of Afghanistan, no further questions, it matters whether that is just ripping the Band-Aid off and letting the place collapse, and no matter what the consequences, versus withdrawing the troops responsibly in the context of an actual peace agreement. The latter is pretty responsible, and I mean, it might not look like victory in the sense of the battleship and the Japanese surrendering, but it might look like victory in the sense of the Dayton Accords ending the Balkan Wars, like a really potentially a huge diplomatic moment that ends a conflict. Absent some kind of settlement like that, I think Afghanistan does remain some of the most fertile ground in the world for terrorism, and we all learned the consequences of that. It is already one of the biggest generators of refugees into Europe, especially, which destabilized the politics of Europe for a generation itself. And that would get far worse if Afghanistan deteriorated in the sense that it could in an environment of total chaos. So as fatigued as we might be, like, the US interests here are quite legitimate, and to just watch the place completely melt down, I think we would all regret that, if only for our own national interest, to say nothing of the human suffering it would entail. Pretty soon after we made that decision.
Johnny Walsh, senior expert at the United States Institute of Peace. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.